Good evening. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Jonathan Earl. I'm Associate Director here and a professor in the History Department. We are winding down what I think must be our most active semester of programming in the history of the Dole Institute. I think I counted 30 programs relating to the election and its aftermath, counting study groups. After tonight's program, we have one more public program on Tuesday, December 2nd at 7:30, where we have reporter Linda Robinson from U.S. News coming to talk about her book about General Dave Petraeus, who many of you remember spoke here at the Institute when he was commanding general at Fort Leavenworth back in, was that spring of 05? Spring of 06? Spring of 06. So we're all very interested in General Petraeus at the Dole Institute. As for tonight, we have a great guest with us. In the early 1950s, a young Yale graduate submitted a manuscript to the Regnery Company critical of the Ivy League school and its faculty for forcing liberal ideology on its students. The author called out individual professors by name for their attempts to break down students' religious beliefs through their teaching, and that Yale was denying its students any sense of individualism by forcing them to embrace the growing creed of liberalism. God and Man at Yale received mixed reviews from what I could tell from my research when it was first published, but it would be impossible to understate the impact of that book or its author, William F. Buckley, Jr., would have on American society. The book, in fact, became a launching pad for Buckley, his journal National Review, and indeed an intellectually vibrant conservative movement in the United States. Regnery Publishing was already, and remains, the preeminent conservative publishing house in this country, with authors currently on their list by Pat Buchanan, Ann Coulter, David Horowitz, Michelle Malkin, Oliver North, and many more. Today we have with us Alfred S. Regnery, Henry's son, the publisher of the American Spectator, and former president of Regnery Publishing. During his tenure there, the house published 22 New York Times bestsellers, recruiting a new cadre of conservative authors and having, again, an oversized influence on the politics of our nation. Now we have Al's very own book to discuss tonight, Upstream, The Ascendance of American Conservatism, where he describes the movement's political and intellectual origins, its inventors, its leaders, its high and low points, and its achievements. In it we learn about the books and journals, the columnists and media commentators who drove it forward, and the people and the foundations that supplied the financial means to keep it afloat. In one notable section, Regnery examines the apparent defeat of the conservative movement suffered at the hands of Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1964 and the subsequent rise of Ronald Reagan from the ashes of Barry Goldwater's landslide defeat. This should be required reading for those on my particular side of the aisle, especially those who think that conservatism has, once again, lost its intellectual steam. It has always been my belief that ideas matter in politics, and that the party that puts them to the best use tends to do better winning elections and enacting policy. Alfred Regnery was educated at Beloit College and received his law degree from the University of Wisconsin. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan to serve in the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and as Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Land and Natural Resources Division, both at the U.S. Department of Justice. He also served as minority counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Regnery is of counsel to the Washington law firm of Keller and Heckman. Tonight, for a particularly timely discussion, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Al Regnery to the Dole Institute. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Al. It's great to have you here on campus at the Dole Institute. And what we want to do tonight is we want to talk a little bit about the history of the conservative movement, which Al's book goes into in some depth. And then we'll kind of shift gears and talk about the future of the conservative movement. But kind of start with sketching out in a broad way the beginning of the conservative movement, the intellectual conservative movement, and kind of the big components like the traditionalists, the anti-communists, the libertarians, the fusionists.
So there weren't any conservatives in 1945. The word wasn't used. There were certainly a few members of Congress, a few governors and others who were conservative Republicans, but they were really voices in the wilderness. If Senator Taft, for example, who was Mr. Republican, Mr. Conservative, would have gotten up to give a speech on the Senate floor, he sat down and there was really nobody that picked it up. There was no conservative movement or anything else. But there were a few people who began to challenge the status quo. In economics, what they called central planning in those days was pretty much the predominant prevailing view. And there were a group of economists, Friedrich Hayek being one of them, Ludwig von Mises another one, Milton Friedman came along pretty soon, and some others, who started talking about capitalism, about free markets, about individual liberty. Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, was published in 1944, I think in England, in 1945 here. And it was a refreshing voice. It was, what he said was that socialism, which he said was where the world was going, was the way to slavery, to serfdom, and that he had all kinds of examples and looked at everything really in economic terms. And the book had an enormous impact. I mean, I think there were over 1 million copies of the book that were distributed in 1945-46, which in those days was almost unheard of. So that began to have some currency. Well, then 2 or 3 years later, Russell Kirk published a book called The Conservative Mind, which Kirk was an instructor, I think, at Michigan State at the time, young man who had studied in Scotland. He looked at the conservative tradition going back a couple of hundred years, and what he did was to lay out sort of a roadmap of traditional conservatism, that is, talked about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, about individual liberty, about traditional Western values, Western civilization, and to him, the most important thing was to preserve Christendom, Western civilization. The third group were the anti-communists, and of course, the Soviet Union had been our ally during World War II. As we came out of the war, people began to wonder whether this was going to continue to be our ally, but there were still a good many liberals who were running things in the government, who had worked with the Soviets during the war, who, for whatever reason, thought that they could be accepted into the world community. But a group of people, many of whom were former communists themselves, who had broken with the party, began to argue with that. The big book was Whittaker Chambers' book, Witness. And Chambers, of course, had been a communist, had testified against Alger Hiss in one of the most famous spy cases of the century. Hiss eventually was convicted, actually, of perjury because the statute of limitations had run. But Chambers became something of a folk hero. His book, Witness, was a description of the spy case and why he had broken with communism, and then what the evils of communism were. And there were a good many others as well. So the anti-communist movement grew up. And the three of them, the traditionalists, what they called themselves libertarians at the time, the free market people, and the anti-communists, didn't really think of themselves as in the same camp, particularly. They weren't a movement or anything else. But as the decade wore on into the 50s and so on, they began to realize that they had a common enemy, and that was the left. Whether it be American liberalism or socialism was growing in Europe, or communism itself. And so little by little they came together. Bill Buckley started National Review in about 1955. And that was the first time that anybody actually had a magazine that talked about these things. And he brought a good many of the people I just mentioned and others together on the staff. The magazine had instant appeal across the country. People realized that there were other people in the country that were thinking the same way. And so little by little, this intellectual movement formed, and it grew, and people, others emerged. There were various professors that would surface on college campuses and talk about these things and so on. And all of that, of course, it wasn't really a political movement at all. In politics, the big event, of course, was in 1952 when Robert Taft was running for the Republican nomination, came to the convention with actually more delegates than Eisenhower had. Eisenhower didn't know if he was a Republican or Democrat. The Democrats had recruited him, as did the Republicans. He wasn't a member of a party, and said he would run as a Republican. Got to the convention, and people thought that although Taft was ahead, had more delegates, that Eisenhower was more likely to win, and nominated him. And so there was a sort of that was really the first political thing that happened, because people recognized that Taft was so conservative. He was also really an isolationist and a different kind of conservative than you have now. And then, of course, eventually that evolved into the Goldwater effort, and it became a political movement.
How big, John mentioned Bill Buckley, and you mentioned Buckley, and we were talking at lunch today about, you specifically mentioned his book, The Unmaking of America, which I told you I'd read when I was in high school, but put Bill Buckley's contribution to all of this in context for us. I mean, how critical was he to the whole kind of gelling of the conservative movement?
Oh, he was huge. He was he was vital to it. I mean, I think I mentioned in the book that if it hadn't been for Bill Buckley, if he hadn't come along, if the movement existed at all, it would have looked very, very different. For one thing, when he first emerged in 1951, when he published God and Man at Yale, the movement, the people that were in it were these old Europeans. Most people were 50, 60 or older. Many of them spoke with foreign accents. I mean, it wasn't vibrant at all. I mean, there was nothing to attract people. Bill Buckley comes along. He's 27, 20 years old. He's as glib as he was in later life. I mean, he was good-looking. He was quick. He was bright. He had a great sense of humor. And, of course, he graduated from Yale. He'd been the editor of the Yale Daily News. He had all these things going for him. And suddenly, I mean, he becomes a sort of a folk hero. He writes this book, which is an instant bestseller. Everybody, I mean, you look at the reviews. In my book, I quote some of the reviews. And what people said about him were unbelievable. There was one review that McGeorge Bundy wrote, who subsequently became, of course, one of Lyndon Johnson's top people, and he called Buckley a twisted young man. He said he should be basically should be in a straitjacket. Get this guy out of here. I mean, he has no right to say these things, and that was typical of what they said. And Buckley, of course, was so quick that whenever anybody said something like that about him, he'd come back with something that was twice as good. And so he was pretty soon he started going around to campuses speaking, and I mean he was. Everybody sort of wanted to talk like Bill Buckley, to look like Bill Buckley, but he was also extremely erudite, extremely bright, a wonderful writer. Wrote, 50 books during the course of his life. Then he started the magazine, and so he was everywhere. And I think he completely changed the whole process.
Speak a little bit to the role of the various conservative think tanks. I mean, they weren't involved early in the process of conservatism, but as conservatism got a little bit older and went into the 70s, places like Heritage and a lot of other places started to grow up where academics and policy experts could get together and really kind of, put together conservative solutions to particular governmental problems.
Well, there are lots of those now. I mean, you mentioned a couple of them. American Enterprise Institute is another, and the Cato Institute, the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And there are places like this all over the country. I mean, every state has a think tank of some sort or an institute. They've made a huge contribution also because they have been a place where people come together and they stimulate each other. Then there are other things as well. I talk in my book about the Mont Pelerin Society, and that was a group of economists that first met in 1947, I think. Hayek pulled them together in Switzerland. And he brought about 40 economists together the first time from around the world who believed in free markets. And reading what they said, they got there and they said that they realized that there were other people in the world that thought the same way they did. Because they thought they were just a voice in the wilderness out where they were doing things. So the same thing that the think tanks do now. They are a hub of activity. They generate all kinds of papers, books, lectures, and things like that. But even more than that, they stimulate the people that are in them. They give them a home. And many of those people go on to do very significant things in terms of formulating policies, formulating ideas and whatnot that have such a big impact.
One of the things that I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with the conservative movement don't realize is the incredible intellectual depth of it, the fact that people are really very knowledgeable and they spend a lot of time studying it. But one of the reasons that that's the case, I think, is largely because of Regnery publishing and what your dad, Henry Regnery, did in terms of going out and finding really outstanding thinkers on the conservative side and making sure that their works were published.
Well, he did. The conservative movement really is a movement of ideas. I mean, although we think of it in political terms, in essence, it's the ideas that I mentioned before that are its foundation. Capitalism, free markets, the Constitution, traditional American values, strong national defense, things like that. And those ideas have been fleshed out in all sorts of writings. My father, in fact, for whatever reason, happened to be at the right place at the right time. He had come from an industrial family and worked in the family business, didn't like it very much. He was an intellectual himself. And he thought that he could best serve his country by helping people formulate these ideas. And so the books that he published were primarily, very few of them were actually bestsellers. There were 2 or 3 that were, but for the most part they were pretty heavy intellectual books that people read, but which planted seeds that took hold, and many of them are still growing. I mean, books like The Conservative Mind, which is still in print, published in 1953, which for the first time gave conservatives an intellectual roadmap of what it was that they believed and where those ideas came from, who the people were that went back to, as I said, back to the founders in many cases, and Europeans as well as Americans who had written about these things and so on.
One of the things that really drove the ability of the conservative movement to kind of grow and succeed was its financial support. Where did that come from? Because that was a wholly new source that was fairly unique to the movement.
Well, first of all, it wasn't very much money. In terms, I have a chapter on the donors in my book, and it's really interesting to contrast the money that conservatives had, even still today, as compared to what money the left has. Today I looked at the biggest foundations, and I think that if I remember correctly, the 5 largest conservative foundations have less money in their corpus, in their principal, than the 5 largest liberal foundations give away in a year. And that's always been the case. But there were a group of people that most of them were self-made businessmen who believed in the ideas that were being talked about. Many of them said that they had built their businesses on the concepts of free market capitalism, and they felt obligated to keep that alive. John Olin was one of them. He was from out here someplace. I think he was from St. Louis, actually, the Olin Corporation. And he was a huge donor. Basically gave all of his money away to conservative causes before he died. And Roger Milliken, who's still alive from Milliken Mills, was another one. Henry Salvatore. There are a group of people like that, maybe a dozen or 15 of them, who were fairly significant donors. But then what also happened is, very interestingly, as this went on, conservatives discovered that there were lots of little donors. And that's why we haven't gotten there yet, but when you get to the Goldwater campaign in 1964, the thing that he did was people recognized that across the country that they agreed with this guy. And so they started sending him $5 and $10. And this had never happened before. And so actually from that, mailing lists were built up during the Goldwater campaign, which became the lifeblood of the conservative movement. This direct mail fundraising and people giving small amounts of money, but lots of them, is really what is still the foundation of the think tanks, candidates, all sorts of other causes that exist.
Basically, direct mail was in effect created by the conservative movement, right?
Yeah, what happened was at the end of the Goldwater campaign, in those days, of course, there were no computers. They kept the donors on 3x5 cards, and the law was that you had to give the list of the donors to the clerk of the Senate, I think it was. And a guy named Richard Regnery, who had been involved in sort of the beginnings of this sort of thing, went up to the Senate clerk's office and brought in a bunch of temporary workers and sat down and copied the lists. And there were 600,000 donors, I think, and after about 20 or 30,000 or so, they said they threw him out. They said, "Well, you can't be up here anymore." But he had enough to get started. He started mailing to these people and started building lists up. So that basically invented direct mail fundraising, and it became, as I say, the lifeblood of the conservative movement.
Goldwater was the champion of conservatives in 1964. He had a devastating defeat, and yet in many ways it really led to future successes by conservatives.
Well, more than that, I think that the Goldwater campaign revolutionized American politics like no other campaign maybe until now. And it's very interesting what happened. Goldwater was actually nominated for vice president in 1960. And he said he wasn't going to accept the nomination, but his name was put in nomination, and the rally and so on that went on for much more than Nixon got at that convention. He left that convention as the hero. And then, you may remember, he ran against Nelson Rockefeller in the primaries, ultimately was nominated in 1964. And there was a huge split in the Republican Party. The Republican Party was basically controlled in those days by what was known as the Eastern Establishment. And the Rockefellers were the primary benefactors and the owners of that. So Goldwater beats Rockefeller. He gets nominated, runs against Lyndon Johnson. I think he recognized that there was no way that he could win. Of course, Kennedy had been assassinated a year before, and the consensus was that people didn't want to have 3 presidents in a year, that 2 was enough. And Johnson was the president, so he ran with all of the trappings of presidential power. And Goldwater was his own guy. I mean, he did what he wanted to do. He didn't listen to his handlers or anything else. And it's going back and reading about it, it's a very entertaining campaign, if nothing else. But by the end of it, when Goldwater lost by, I think he carried 5 states and got 37% of the vote, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, Johnson just creamed him, in other words. But out of the ashes of that campaign, you look back, Goldwater had, as I mentioned, somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million contributors. Contrast that with Nixon when he ran in 1960, had about 40,000 contributors, which was, I think, the most anybody had ever had until that time. So basically what this meant was it was the people that were giving small amounts of money suddenly owned the Republican Party. I mean, these were the conservatives. There were something like 3 million people who actually worked for Goldwater at one point or another during the campaign. People that actually went out and did things. I mean, nobody had ever had more than a few thousand. So we had this huge group of people that wanted to do things. It started this process of wrenching the Republican Party away from the Eastern establishment. The center of it used to be in the Northeast. Goldwater, of course, came from Arizona, so the center of the Republican Party starts to move to the center of the country. Then there are a bunch of other things, but the one thing that probably made the most difference was the Sunday night before the Tuesday election. The Goldwater campaign bought half an hour of time on the 3 networks, and they got this B-class actor from Hollywood to give a speech. And Ronald Reagan gave this unbelievable speech. And I would just suggest when you go home, go onto Google and put in Reagan Goldwater speech, and you can hear it. And it's just, it'll bring tears to your eyes. I mean, it's Ronald Reagan at his absolute best. He gave this speech that, first of all, I think that it brought in more money than Goldwater had raised for the entire campaign, because Reagan said at the end, send in your checks to this post office box, and they came in by the truckloads. They kept replaying the speech again and again. So by the time it was done, people said, we think we may have nominated the wrong guy, but that's what introduced Ronald Reagan to American politics. And then, of course, 2 years later, 1966, Reagan runs for governor of California and wins. And I think one thing that's very, very telling is that when Goldwater ran in 1964, he lost California by about 1 million votes. 2 years later, Reagan runs on pretty much the same principles that Goldwater ran on. He won California by 1 million votes. And it's just because of the way he talked, the way he presented issues, the way he did things. And of course, from then on, Ronald Reagan basically became the standard bearer of the whole conservative movement.
And he was extraordinarily successful, but what a lot of people don't understand, that was going to be my next question about who was the big winner out of 64, and you already got to it. But,
well, and actually I should say that, as I said, Goldwater is basically the winner in 1960, okay? Nixon runs and he loses, but Goldwater's the one everybody's talking about. Well, then in 1964, Reagan gives the speech, and he suddenly becomes the winner. Now, again, in 1976, when Reagan ran against Jerry Ford, he gave a speech at the end of the Republican convention, and he walked out of that convention. Basically, he was the hero rather than Jerry Ford. So with that, when people said that was the first speech of the 1980 campaign. So you have this funny phenomenon of the losers in these 3 situations actually turning into the winner. I don't know what that says about 2008. I guess probably remains to be seen, doesn't it?
I think so. One of the things, and we had the honor on Sunday afternoon of having President George H.W. Bush here. Mm-hmm. And a good president, essentially a conservative president. But I think a lot of conservatives feel that maybe Reagan kind of derailed his own revolution a little bit by putting Bush on the ticket. Would conservatives have been better served had, say, Senator Paul Laxalt, a movement conservative, been put on the ticket in 1980?
Well, it's always easier to look back, I guess, 28 years later, isn't it? Who knows? I mean, that was the all of the things that go in politics that resulted in George Bush being the nominee. I actually worked for Paul Laxalt in 1980. I was his Senate counsel and so on, and so I was pretty close to him. And he was actually somebody they talked about as a vice presidential candidate. And he took himself out of the running because he had been governor of Nevada. And as governor of Nevada, he'd actually owned a casino for a while after he was governor. He had had a lot to do with various people that the rest of the country would think were unsavory as the governor of Nevada because they owned the casinos, those are the people that were there. And he thought that it would do more damage to Ronald Reagan if he were on the ticket than what he could have brought. There were other people, of course, but Bush had been pretty much the runner-up in the primaries, and I think Reagan felt that it would sort of pull things together. And you remember when Reagan was nominated in 1980, it wasn't at all clear that he could win. I mean, he's running against an incumbent president.
Right.
He was behind in the polls until like the 25th of October. And so they were trying to do whatever they could do to win the election. And Bush had quite a lot of support in the primaries. So I don't think it was probably so much an ideological question as it was a political question.
Right, right. Kind of describe why Reagan was so successful.
Why was Reagan so successful? Well, he was, I think probably more than anything else, it was because he was consistent in what he believed. I mean, he was certainly a very attractive person. He had a great sense of humor. He had a wonderful way of talking to an audience. I mean, he was a natural politician. But it was more than that. It was, Reagan had started thinking about these things in the early 50s when he was in Hollywood. Of course, he had this confrontation with the communist infiltrated unions in Hollywood. He had testified in 1948, I think, before the House Committee on Un-American Activities against communist infiltration of Hollywood. He'd read Hayek and von Mises. He'd read Chambers. He'd read Kirk. And all those things. So he knew the issues inside out. Margaret Thatcher once said about him that he said he didn't have all that many ideas, but the ideas that he had were very big ones and they were very well conceived. And he was, I mean, people used to give Ronald Reagan short shrift for not being that well prepared, which is completely wrong. I mean, he was better prepared probably than anybody that's run for president in a century, because he had, I remember, in fact, the interesting comment that he made when he was first, soon after he was elected, he was in the White House, and a reporter said, "How was it that you came to be so conservative? Who taught you all these things?" And he laughed and he said, well, as he always did, he said, "I wrote my own speeches." He said, "I did the reading," and he said, "I educated myself." And so, I remember people would say that as they listened to Ronald Reagan, said, "I don't agree with him, but I can listen to him, and I believe it. I think he believes what he says, and I think he's going to do what he says he's going to do." And I think that was probably the crux of it. Though it was really as the ideas, the philosophy that he adhered to.
Historians who are favorable to Reagan, and other historians for that matter, would count as his greatest achievement a pretty significant role. Some would argue the leading role, but most would give him credit for a very significant role in the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Soviet Union. In an odd way, didn't that kind of undermine the conservative movement, because anti-communism was kind of the glue that held the various groups together? And hasn't that made it a little bit more complicated for conservatives to be successful?
Yeah, it certainly has. I mean, it is a funny conflict in a way, because it's what they set out to do. I mean, what would an analogy be, I guess, if Christians were to get rid of the devil and there wasn't any evil in the world anymore? Would there any point in being a Christian? I mean, but that's probably true. But nevertheless, we're all much better off without him.
Absolutely. absolutely. Talk a little bit about the, obviously, President Clinton was elected in 1992, and he was elected over President Bush, and at least arguably he was elected because Ross Perot pulled a very significant portion of the vote out. But he moved quickly to the left and ran into all kinds of trouble. What were the forces that drove the kind of Gingrich contract with America revolution in 1994?
Well, a lot of it was opposition to what was happening in the Clinton administration. One of the things that Bill Clinton did, which I guess has been a pretty good lesson so far for Obama, was he turned over the legislative effort to the Congress. He didn't control it from the White House. And interestingly, if you look at the makeup of the Congress when Clinton first was elected, it's almost exactly the same as it is now. I mean, I think he had 57 Democratic senators and pretty nearly exactly the same number of House members. And of course, within 2 years, Gingrich's revolution came along and took control of the House and then the Senate pretty soon after that. But the big factor was universal health care. That was the thing that probably energized people more than anything else. But there were a series of other things that Clinton did as well. Right away, he did the gays in the military issue, which I think alienated a lot of people. There were 2 or 3 other big things right off the bat, and basically what they were doing was overreaching. They thought they had this big majority, they could do what they wanted. Clinton had made all sorts of promises to everybody, and they started enacting these things, and they recognized that, in fact, that's not what people wanted them to do. So you had this, actually I think there were 50-some-odd House members who were defeated, Democrats, in '94, which was probably the first time Republicans had gotten control of the House since, the 30s. But, and in fact, the House of Representatives is arguably the most important, most powerful entity in Washington. If you have the House, you can do about anything you want. If you don't, they can stop it. And people don't recognize that. Clinton did, I think, as they realized that they were going to lose in 1994. And from what I've heard from people that were there inside these meetings in the White House, that they recognized this was pretty much the end of what that they were not going to be able to accomplish the rest of their agenda.
Right. Right. Although there are conservatives, maybe not many of them, who might argue that based upon balancing the budget, based upon welfare reform, based upon other things that Clinton did, largely under the influence of Republican Senate and House, that he might have been the most conservative president since Reagan.
Well, you can make that case, actually. In certain things, that's right.
What about our current president, George Bush? Is he a conservative? Has he governed, I should say, as a conservative?
No. He's done some conservative things. I think he has some conservative tendencies, but he doesn't have any coherent conservative philosophy. He doesn't have a set of principles by which he decides, which he uses to decide what he's going to do. I don't think he ever did. I don't think he ever made any pretense of doing that. He ran a reasonably conservative campaign, largely because Karl Rove recognized that was the best way to win, probably both times, in 2000 and 2004. But if you look at his record, he appointed a lot of good judges, and of course he appointed 2 extremely good Supreme Court justices. Although I think those were not his choices, those were the conservative movement's choices. The end of my book is a description of the nomination and the confirmation of Alito and Roberts. And what I concluded was that the conservative movement brought enough pressure on Bush that he appointed those people rather than the ones he wanted and got them confirmed. But he appointed a lot of other good lower court judges as well. And of course he did tax cuts, which conservatives liked a lot. But other than that, there are not many things that he did which are consistent with conservative philosophy. Certainly his spending habits were more liberal than Bill Clinton's. Basically fiscal irresponsibility, I guess I would say. Foreign policy, you can probably argue both ways. I mean, and I don't think it's clear yet even what what the consequences of his foreign policy will have been. But, of course, there were many conservatives who opposed our going into Iraq, and there were other kinds of conservatives, basically, who designed it and orchestrated it. So overall, I don't know. I was talking to Ed Meese a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him, what do you think about the Bush legacy? 10 years from now, will he be viewed as negatively as he is now? And Ed said no. He said, I think that people will recognize that actually he was consistent on a lot of things, and he did a lot of things that we don't recognize now that were pretty positive. That's certainly not the situation now.
One of the things that, and your book actually covers this, but I actually had remembered this and have asked previous guests about it. In 1971, a number of conservative organizations, I think led by National Review and Bill Buckley, and I believe your book said it was the Manhattan Group or something like that, got together, said that Richard Nixon was too liberal. They had supported him in his campaign, said that he was too liberal, and they, quote, suspended support for him. And it was clearly just, it didn't have any real meaning other than they were standing up and saying, we are not responsible for what he's doing. Why didn't that happen with President Bush?
That's a good question. I think people never really got together. There was lots of griping about it, but nobody ever did. Probably for one thing, because there really wasn't an alternative. Because by that time, conservatives had gotten spoiled. They realized that winning was a pretty good thing. I mean, back in those days, as you said, with the Buckley crowd and so on knew that if they didn't support Nixon, they didn't have anywhere else to go. But it was strictly basically an academic exercise, I guess. But by now, conservatives had 8 years of Reagan. Many conservatives had worked for George W. Bush, and I think they thought that they could win with him. And I suppose I'm just speculating that it wouldn't have really had any point.
Aren't conservatives kind of then, complicit in kind of the Republican Party's disavowal of conservative principles, at least?
Many of them are, but since I published this book, I've given a lot of talks to groups like this, and I'm invariably asked, or I was before the election, we don't really think John McCain is a conservative. Should people sit out this election and let the Democrats win and then come back in 4 years and during the time regroup and actually come up with a conservative and let the Democrats get themselves into trouble as they always do, and it'll give us more of an incentive to come back? And there are certainly always people that feel that way. I don't think there was a great movement in this case, probably because, for one thing, people felt that Obama was so liberal that it would be more damaging to do that than the other way. What I would answer was, in 1976, you had that situation with Reagan and Ford. Reagan, in 76, ran against Ford in the primaries. He very nearly won. I mean, he came to the convention with maybe 75 fewer delegates than Ford had. I mean, it was very, very close. And conservatives who had supported Reagan, for the most part, or many of them, simply sat it out. I don't know how they voted, but they didn't do anything for Ford under the thesis that it would be better if this guy lost. We can then help Reagan organize and so on and come back in 1980, and that's exactly what happened. And Reagan, in fact, if he had won in 76, very likely wouldn't have won, and if he would have won, he probably would have had a much more difficult time governing successfully than he did in 1980, because of events, for one thing, and because of the fact that he was able to spend that 4 years educating the country with his radio shows and assembling a staff of people and that sort of thing. But so yeah, that's always a question. I think in this case between McCain and Obama, people felt that, and as I used to say, I mean, just look at the Supreme Court. That's probably all you need to know is the people that Obama would appoint to the court, as opposed to people McCain would appoint, would make the difference one way or another in 4 years. They could do anything else, but that was, in essence, the most important thing.
Right. Let's move to the future with a couple more questions, and then we're going to open it up to your questions that you have for Al tonight. Let's start with our president-elect. One could make the case that because of his fairly consistently liberal voting record in the U.S. Senate, and because of some of the things said in the Democratic nomination contest, that he's going to be, pretty far left. One could also make the case that he moved to the center in the general election. He clearly is an extraordinarily, especially given his experience, he's an extraordinarily savvy and shrewd politician. Mm-hmm. One can make the case that he understands that if he goes as far left as Speaker Pelosi and Leader Reid want to go, that it could self-destruct his own presidency and basically cause his agenda to fail. Which president do you think we're going to get?
I think we're going to get both of them. And what I think he's going to do is, on the surface, my guess is he will govern as a moderate Democrat. And I would guess that he will have a couple Republicans in his cabinet. He'll make conciliatory speeches that will pulling people together and talk about the need to get things done, what works, he says. But he'll also do things behind the scenes which people won't notice, which will be very far to the left. And primarily, I think that with his appointments, first of all, he owes the left a huge amount, and they're going to call in their chits. These are people that really went out of their way for him, and they're already there very vocally saying, here's what we want. So he will appoint people that are very far to the left to the commissions, the assistant secretaries, those 2,000 or 3,000 jobs which in the aggregate have a great deal of power. And those are people that, for the most part, function outside the news media. You don't really read very much about them. But they have a lot of power. And he'll pay off the left with those. He'll also do other things, like, for example, I would guess that he will, at some point, they will have a middle-class tax cut, as he's promised. And it'll be sold as an across-the-board tax cut. At the same time, they'll impose a carbon credit tax or a value-added tax or something like that, which affects everybody, but they will sell it on the basis that, well, just the corporations are paying it, or just the electric companies or the coal companies are paying it. And of course, it's going to make everybody's cost of everything go up, or a value-added tax, which is added onto everything you buy. So that basically you've got a tax increase on everybody, but telling people that you actually have a tax decrease. So whether he can get away with that or not, I don't know. But that's my predictions, how things will be.
You have been part of a number of meetings that have occurred literally in the 2+ weeks since the election that have focused on the future of conservatism, where conservatives can go from here. Talk a little bit about that. Talk about the mood in those meetings, how people feel, and kind of what you think the future of conservatism is.
Well, these are meetings that have been called, there have been several of them in the last couple of weeks, among conservative leaders to discuss where we are and where we go. And the consensus is that the conservative movement as such outside the Republican Party is pretty strong. I mean, we have these think tanks, we've got activist organizations, we've got a pretty good communication system, we've got lots of people, we've got good ideas, the fundamentals are still very sound. I think the recognition is the Republican Party has all sorts of huge problems, and that conservatives basically need to get control of it. And one of the ideas that keeps coming up is that we have to get back to sort of basic principles, reassert the principles that are the foundation of the conservative movement, that there are coalitions that can be built. One of the things that's discussed, of course, is that if there were the three branches of conservatism I originally talked about, it's more than that now. Of course, you have the evangelical Christians, which make up probably the largest voting bloc, but which don't get along very well with the libertarians. And so you've got all different sorts of people, and I think that most people recognize that it's time that many of those differences be put aside and people work together. That even if we disagree on some things, that we need to find those places where we agree. But I think generally the thought is that there will be a backlash against this administration, like there always is, and that politics in America is cyclical, that will be back, and it may be sooner than you think. The system works pretty well. The political system does. The constitutional system. It's reasonably quick to self-correct when something gets too far off one way or the other. And we have a lot of very able people in terms of looking at a future leader. There is no Ronald Reagan out there that you can tap into. But then, they said, when in the 70s, it wasn't really all that obvious that Ronald Reagan was the leader either. What's been discussed is that instead of latching on to somebody, whoever it might be, that you, in essence, put together a job description of what you're looking for. And you let people apply for the job, and you watch them do their talk shows and their speeches and write their books and all the other things. And over the course of the next couple of years, we figure out which one best fits that job description, and that's the one that gets the job, which is probably a good way to do it. But there are a good many very able people. You know the names. There are 3 or 4 governors. There are a number of House members. There's some senators. And then, of course, the other thing that you have to remember is that 4 years ago, Obama had just been elected a senator from Illinois, and most people didn't know who he was. He'd been a state senator, and he came out of there to now be President of the United States. So things in this country can move pretty quickly if things happen to go the right way. And so there probably are a good many people that none of us have ever heard about yet that are the same kind of potential leader that he is.
Very good point. We're going to open up to Q&A now. I think we have a couple students that will have cordless mics. I realize you probably don't need the cordless mic for us to hear you, but we digitally record all of these programs. It'll be on our website, so we ask that you raise your hand, wait for the cordless mic to come by, and then ask your question.
If conservatives don't get control of the Republican Party, do you think there's a possibility they would create a third party?
No, third parties just don't work very well in this country. The whole system is set up in such a way that people have tried it before and they never get more than half or 1 or 1.5%, 2% of the vote. Ross Perot was an exception for whatever reason. Of course, he self-financed the thing. In terms of the Republican Party, there really isn't any other group that would get control of the Republican Party except for the professionals. And that's one of the discussions that's going on in these meetings that I mentioned earlier, that the word that is used that the Republican Party has a staph infection. In other words, it's the staff of the Republican Party that is the problem. And that and these professional consultants who run the campaigns, who always do it the same way, and they always set it up so that they get the business the next time. And the conservatives on the Republican side are really the only ones who are organized. I mean, there's nobody. They're disparate people here and there, but there's no group that has the potential of doing it. So it's really the professionals, I guess, against the people that are the true believers.
Okay. We have a question right here.
You stated earlier that the Republicans didn't find McCain conservative enough. Why do you think we chose him to represent the Republican Party then instead of Mitt Romney?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
You stated earlier that the conservatives didn't find McCain conservative enough.
Okay, right.
Why did we choose him to represent us in the general election over someone like Mitt Romney?
Well, Romney was doing pretty well. Of course, he pulled himself out for whatever reason. Primaries don't necessarily always reflect what people want. I mean, there wasn't any clear leader. And of course, remember, in August of 2007, McCain was broke. He was not. Everybody considered was waiting for him to get out day to day. He had no campaign left. He was able to bring it back together again. Romney spent $30 or $40 million of his own money and hadn't won any primaries, but he was doing fairly well, and then he just pulled out, I don't know, for whatever reason. So I'm not sure that there's really any answer to that. Had there been somebody that was clearly the conservative leader, he very likely might have been nominated. People said that in the primaries, basically, you had each of the branches of the conservative movement had its own candidate. That might have been the problem. I mean, you had Huckabee, who basically represented the evangelicals and the more traditionals. McCain, who was the foreign policy conservative, Romney, who was the economic conservative, Giuliani, I guess he would have been more the neocon, and so they split up, and everybody has their peculiarities and their flaws. So I'm not sure there's really any good answer to that question. The process.
Okay. Next question. Get right here.
This may be something you don't want to discuss, but I've been subscribing to American Spectator since the days it was published like a newspaper on newsprint, a long time ago. I'm aware of the problems that occurred during the Clinton administration with the IRS or whatever, which seemed to me instructive about the misuse of government power, and I wonder if you could make some comments about that.
Sure. The American Spectator was very vocal in criticizing the Clinton administration. In fact, it discovered Paula Jones. It had a couple of investigative reporters who were on the Clintons all the time. They had a thing they called the Arkansas Project, where they actually had reporters in Arkansas digging up this stuff and so on. And the Clintons basically got back at it by calling them before a grand jury. There wasn't really any cause for that, but it cost them a lot of money to defend themselves. The magazine actually, publishing an opinion magazine is a difficult business in this country. There's no money in it, but during those times, the circulation expanded immensely. Because they were running these stories about Clinton and so on, and it got pretty much out of control. People subscribed that didn't really want to subscribe to a magazine. The people that were running it weren't particularly good business people, and it basically went broke. They kept it going. It was purchased. It was sold again. It's a long, involved story. I became the publisher about 5 years ago, and at that point it was almost out of business, and I thought it was a good challenge for me that if we could bring it back on a business-like basis. And we've done that, and I hope you'll agree that it's a respectable magazine now. Good.
Other questions for Al tonight? Wait for the microphone, please, sir. Thank you.
How do you categorize Newt at this stage of the game, and will he play a role in playing any sort of considerable role in the conservative movement at all, or what?
Newt Gingrich, categorizing Newt is, I guess, pretty difficult. I'm not sure he could even do that. I think he continues to play a big role because he's very vocal. He's got lots of ideas. He's talking about running for chairman of the Republican National Committee. I mentioned in my book, I think he's a great revolutionary and a lousy leader. And what he should have done when he took over the House was basically turn it over to somebody else to let them run it, and found something else to revolutionize. Now, I think if he could split the duties of the Republican National Committee, it would probably be a pretty good thing, because wherever he goes, he dominates the conversation. He talked about running for president this time. I think he seriously considered it. And I remember people used to say, if he got into those primaries, you remember those debates they had when there were four of them running, if he had been in the primaries, it would have been all about Newt. Nobody else would have been able to get an idea in edgewise. And if he had even been, if he had been debating Hillary Clinton, can you imagine what it would be fantastic? Because he's so good at all those things. But God forbid if he ever got elected, So I think he thinks about running in 2012. And he recognizes he's got lots of baggage, and so I don't know what'll happen. But in the meantime, I think he continues. He's got an organization. He travels around and speaks and writes and has a huge email list, and I guess he probably stimulates a lot of people's thinking.
We have another question right there.
Yes, thank you for your candor this evening. I have a question related to, I get tired of hearing all these demand-side stimulus Keynesian arguments about the economy. Who's going to carry the torch to let people understand that spending their own money and supply-side Austrian school economics is the way of the future and the way it should be?
Well, right now it's pretty hard to do, simply because everybody has bought into this statism idea that everybody needs to be bailed out. It's the current president believes it, Obama believes it, McCain believed it, too many members of Congress do. I think we all know that it's not going to work. And I think actually a good many of them probably realize that too. That's why they're not handing all this money over to the automobile companies, because they realize that it's not actually going to bail them out. Who is going to emerge as the spokesman? I don't know. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, perhaps.
Question right here.
Since we're talking about people, what about Karl Rove? Do you think he'll run from Texas for like the Senate or something?
I have no idea what Karl Rove will do. He's a brilliant political strategist, but it's all strategy, and I think that that's the problem. He doesn't really have principles, and I think that he obviously got George Bush elected twice, but if they had then sent him back to work on campaigns and not give him a role in telling Bush, advising Bush on what to do substantively, because he only thought of it substantively as how do you actually win elections. I actually asked him one time, he was talking to a conservative group, and I said, how can you possibly justify, this was some time ago, the first farm bill, which was this $40 billion bill that subsidized farmers. And he said, well, $40 billion is a small price to pay to elect 3 senators. Well, that's the mentality. So if you, I don't know what he's going to do.
Any other questions tonight for Al? Last chance. Okay.
Well, thank you all very much. I certainly appreciate your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Al. We really appreciate it.